In this video, I'm going to talk to you about macroeconomic fluctuation, sometimes called the business cycle. Economists have moved away from describing fluctuations as the business cycle because that suggests that there's something regular or predictable about these fluctuations. And you'll see in a minute that that's not the case. So let's talk about the situation when we are not fluctuating, or real GDP is equal to potential. We define potential GDP as the level of output such that there's no cyclical unemployment. So unemployment is equal to the natural rate. That means there's no slack in the labor market or excess supply of labor. That also means there's no tightness in the labor market, no shortage of labor, and no upward pressure on wages. A nice labor market equilibrium. And that also suggests that capital utilization is normal. So we are operating at capacity. Maybe our factories aren't running 24 hours a day. They're running the normal, perhaps 18 hours a day. We're not here to talk about potential GDP. We're here to talk about fluctuations and deviations from potential GDP, or the output gap. What happens when GDP is different from potential? Now, what I've shown for you here is real GDP series, actual as measured by the Bureau of Economic Analysis, and potential as estimated by the Congressional Budget Office. And I'm also showing you these gray bars. And these gray bars represent recessionary periods as defined by the National Bureau of Economic Research Dating Committee. Now, during these recessionary periods, we see that real GDP falls below potential. But let's take a closer look and just look at the deviation. So when real GDP is equal to potential, there's no output gap. But during these recessionary periods, real GDP declines and falls below potential. So we have a negative output gap. Now we also see periods of time where real GDP is above potential. So what happens when real GDP is below potential? Well, naturally, the unemployment rate increases. This is when we experience cyclical unemployment. But how much? Okun's law is a rule of thumb. And a rule of thumb that's not exact, but suggests that the cyclical component of unemployment is going to be approximately 1/2 of the output gap. Recall, output gap is percent deviation of real GDP from potential. To just help us with that, let's take a look. Let's pick a year with a really nasty output gap. So here's our output gap that is, we are 8% below potential. Well, Okun's law would suggest that our cyclical unemployment would be equal to -1/2 times -8% is 4%, or 4 percentage points. So here I've plotted for you the unemployment rate actually and the natural level as estimated by the Congressional Budget Office. So this was kind of the point I picked. We've got the unemployment rate at something over 10%. Here's our natural rate at something just a hair over 6%. This difference here, this is our cyclical unemployment. And what you can see here is that that's approximately, not exactly, 4 percentage points. Roughly, we're okay. So what happens during recessions? Well, unemployment increases. How much does it increase? Well, that depends on how deep our recession happens to be, or how far we fall from potential GDP. Now, during recessions, expenditures decline. Again, not surprising. Our private domestic expenditures are consumption and investment. Again, consumption, that's households. Investment is firm spending on capital goods. These private expenditures drop during recessions. What I think is interesting for you to notice is that while consumption declines, investment drops more. Our investment series happens to be more volatile. So let me illustrate that for you. Take a look at this series right here. This series, this pink series, this is consumption relative to potential GDP. There's kind of a trend here, and I don't want you to get too focused on that trend, but what I want you to notice is that consumption comprises a big portion of GDP. And during recessions, not surprisingly, consumption declines. Now, what I'm going to do next is I'm going to overlay investment relative to GDP, and I'm going to plot it relative to this axis right here. Investment comprises a lower share of GDP compared to consumption, somewhere in the neighborhood of 17% instead of 60%. But what I want you to notice is this blue series, this series here, is way more volatile. So if we were to pick a recessionary period, you see that consumption declines by about 1 percentage point, and investment declines by more, by about 4 percentage points. And the recession that precedes the financial crisis, we see something similar. Consumption declines, looks like consumption declines by 4 percentage points, but investment declines by even more. So during recessions, private domestic expenditures decline, consumption declines, but investment declines more.